Well, we can move right along to, I'll just go through our upcoming events. Jonathan was nice enough to provide a list here, and then we'll get started with Gretchen's talk on the Nighthawks. So upcoming events, Monday, February 22nd at 9 a.m.
I guess it's 10.
It's what?
10 a.m. I got the time.
Oh, 10 a.m. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you would know. 10 a.m. February 22nd, which is a Monday. Gwen Calvetti will be presenting Birds and Legend and Lore at the La Crosse Public Library. Mondays on Main, which will be a virtual presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Then our next meeting is Wednesday, March 17th at 7 p.m., also virtual. We will be having a program presented by Carla Blom with the International Owl Center in Houston, Minnesota. And I believe it is, Jonathan said it was going to be The Adventures of Minnie Houston, one of their captive owls, I believe, as it travels to owl researchers around the world. So that might be pretty adventurous and interesting. Saturday, April 17th is the Midwest Crane Count.
And that was canceled last year, but I checked on that recently and it does look like it's going to be held. So I think they figured out that, frankly, there wasn't really, because that's an individual event, it could be safely run. So at least at this point, I'm not a compiler for that, but I think I've heard people say that the coordinators have actually been contacted. So it's, it's not 100%, but from what I'm hearing, that's going to be run.
Excellent. Good. Yeah, I was sad that it was canceled last April. I understood because their field people weren't going out, so if they figure they shouldn't have volunteers go out either. But yeah, it's I think Jean Ledman was the coordinator last year.
Yep.
And so hopefully she'll do that again this year. And let's see, our April meeting will be Wednesday, April 21st at 7 p.m. virtual. And that will be presented by Scott May, who's from the National Eagle Center. We'll be discussing golden eagle research. Also coming up in April into May will be the May bird walks. So it's possible here. I don't know if those are going to go forward.
We have to talk about whether or not that's safe and how we would do it. I know that the WSO does still run field trips. The way they've dealt with that is they've actually made it all of those sign-up events and limited participation and made sure everybody had, mandated masks, social distancing, and so on. So, I mean, if we think it's safe to do, the big question is what the scenario is going to be with the pandemic and so on, and whether or not we feel we could come up with a manageable size group. Obviously when we do those, we like to be close together to share bird sightings. That wouldn't be very possible, but it might still be, we're talking about it. Let's put it that way.
Okay, excellent. All right, so we'll just keep everybody posted as that date approaches. Another one that's maybe needs to be decided on too is the Saturday, May 15th trip to Wyalusing State Park.
It'll be the same deal.
Same deal, right? That's what I figured. Okay, and then our May meeting will be May 19th, 7 p.m., also virtually held. That will be with author and ornithologist Laura Erickson, who will present her program Into the Nest. A lot of you may know her from her public broadcasting radio shows that she's done for many years for the birds, it's called. And yeah, she's written several really interesting books. And I believe she spoke to our Coulee Region Audubon many years ago. I think it was in the late 90s. And she was quite interesting. Then tentatively, we have a June 19th potluck scheduled. That would be in Myrick Park. at the gun club shelter. We were supposed to do it last year, obviously, and that was canceled. So we've got the shelter still reserved for this year. So we'll hopefully be able to do that. And then before we get started here, Jonathan wanted me to make sure, I mentioned this earlier, but I'll say it again, that this meeting, the program tonight will be recorded, is being recorded, and will be posted via YouTube on Facebook later for anyone that wants to watch it again, or if you know of anyone that's missing the meeting tonight and would like to see Gretchen's program, it will be available online, and I believe on her blog as well. So tonight's speaker, without any further ado, is Gretchen Newberry, who works for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I believe she became interested in nighthawks, if I'm not mistaken, in graduate school, and put together a program about them. She would like to present that to us tonight. So the stage is yours, Gretchen. And if everybody, looks like most people have their microphone on mute, but if everybody wants to do that to cut down on background noise while Gretchen's giving her presentation, that would be appreciated. Okay.
Great. Well, thank you for having me. So this presentation I'm going to give is based upon my graduate work. I'm not actually here as a representative of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. I have to tell that up front because the views expressed in this presentation are my own and not necessarily those of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So I am going to share my screen and we'll go to my presentation, and this is always kind of tricky. Let's see. How do I do that? I'm supposed to share my desktop. There it is. Okay. Okay. So can you see a presentation? Okay. And if I hit play, does it get big for you guys? Okay, good. That's a good sign. Okay, so this is a common nighthawk, and you guys probably know this bird very well. And you've probably heard this call. I don't know if you can hear the sound. Let's see, is there any nodding? You can hear the sound? Yes? Good. Okay, that means you're going to hear the sound all the way through. Okay, so you probably heard this call around sunset. Maybe it keeps you up at night. So this is an acrobatic bird that you see flying around downtown. It nests on large flat gravel rooftops, like hospitals and schools. So I often see one flying over the farmer's market on Friday nights. That's pretty common occurrence for me. So this is a mysterious bird for a lot of people, but it has become a great way to talk about aerial insectivores, and that is a guild of animals that includes the swallows, the swifts, nighthawks, and bats. So first I'll talk about nighthawks. And so these are migrating nighthawks here in the driftless area outside of La Crosse. It was taken by one of my coworkers on his land. In a minute, you'll see his dog run through. So this is along the Mississippi River, and they migrate through in May and in September, maybe late August. It seems like the prime time to see them migrating is the last weekend in August. And you notice they're pretty quiet when they're migrating, and they're pretty close together. The call you heard at the beginning is something the males do to announce their territory. Sometimes females make calls too. They do this during the breeding season in June and July, and they defend their territories pretty rigorously. So when they're migrating, they can tolerate each other pretty well. In fact, you might have seen the enormous flocks pass through Hawk Ridge and Duluth each fall, and we see them trickling past our shores in groups of 100 or so in May and September. During the breeding season, males cannot tolerate each other very well, so their territories are usually about 1/4 to 1/2 mile apart. So what's a common nighthawk? So if you can't see it, there's a female down there in the gravel. That's a male coming in for a landing. And this was one of my field sites on a hospital in South Dakota. I lived in Vermilion, so this is eastern South Dakota, pretty heavily row cropped area. And so these nighthawks would come to town because they couldn't find grasslands. So common nighthawk, they're not strictly nocturnal, they're not a hawk, and they're becoming less common, so they have the worst name ever. They are a member of the nightjar order, and that's the Capromulgiformes. That's Latin for goat sucker, and they're named for the legend that they would suck milk from livestock. And I think people didn't really understand what this mysterious animal was doing flying around their livestock at sunset, eating insects, so they figured they were drinking their animal's milk. Here in North America, here are nightjars. They are mostly nocturnal. We have whippoorwills, chucklewidows, common porwills, lesser nighthawks, common nighthawks, and Antillean nighthawks. Here in Wisconsin, we have eastern whippoorwills, chucklewidows, and common nighthawks, of course. Less common in North America are the common peroque, which I am positive I am mispronouncing, so I apologize, and the Mexican whippoorwill that you can see in southern Texas and New Mexico. And all of them eat insects and none of them drink the milk of goats. So back to the common nighthawk. So where are these mysterious birds? This is a map from 2007. So some things have changed, quite a few things have changed. In fact, that blue area in Minnesota is now all red. So they are coast to coast in various degrees of success. Red is where they are declining the most. Blue is where they're increasing the most. They're declining in row crop areas, increasing where there's grasslands. They may be doing okay where pastures still are. Overall, they've declined by at least 58% since the 1960s in the US. And in Canada, that number is 80%. They may be increasing in the northern boreal forests of Canada, where breeding bird surveys tend not to go. And they are now largely absent in New England. And in the Southwest, that's the range of the lesser nighthawk. And those two birds do not overlap much. Depending on the time of year, they range from Alaska to Argentina. I travel quite a bit. In grad school, I was part of a study that put satellite transmitters on nighthawks in South Dakota, and those birds went all the way to Argentina and came back. So they moved quite a bit, and they came back to like the same square mile every year. So they need an open space to get their long pointed wings in to build a nest. And actually, they don't even build a nest. They can breed on the ground or on rooftops in open forests, sandbars, grassland, and gravel roofs. They don't build nests in trees, but that bird up in the upper left is a roosting bird, which you might be able to see if you're pretty observant, which is, it's pretty difficult to see them, but I'm sure there's some birders here who have. So they need camouflage for their eggs and chicks. They don't make a nest, so they need to stay with their young for thermoregulation. They're pretty well camouflaged, and if you're having a hard time finding the eggs and chicks in here they are. Little fluffy ones, and then the little gravel eggs. So they are a generalist in theory, but they're becoming more and more of a specialist in their habitat due to the loss of these habitats. So they're losing their open forests and sandbars due to dam construction. So when you don't flood forests, then forests tend to build up a lot of vegetation. Here we've been flooding forests quite a bit recently, it seems, but that's not enough time for them to actually reestablish nesting in those forests. And so when there isn't regular flooding, those river flows no longer scour the sandbars and riverside forests of underbrush that gets in their way. They're not a very agile bird in close quarters. And they have lost a lot of their grasslands in the Great Plains and Midwest due to agricultural intensification, especially during the recent push for biofuel products like ethanol in the last 20 years. And they are losing their gravel rooftops to newer materials and possibly climate change. These rooftops get really hot, and I'll go into more of that later. You probably all use eBird, and so this is a eBird map for common nighthawks during the migration in September. And in May, they, from around here, and birds that come down from Canada are focused mostly on waterways and urban areas where insects tend to be. And at Hawk Ridge Observatory in Duluth, they saw more than 30,000 nighthawks this year in the last couple of weeks of August. So it's a great place to see nighthawks. And along the river here as well. In Minnesota and Wisconsin during the breeding season, they are focused on urban areas and the few remnant grasslands. And interestingly, the pine barrens, since they have lost much of the rest of their habitat. So pine barrens, they are open forests that nighthawks use. Wisconsin just completed their breeding bird atlas. I'm sure you guys participated in that. And it appears that a few breeding nighthawks are concentrated on those pine barren areas. So if you'd like to bird for them in natural areas during the breeding season, you could probably give these places a shot. Here in La Crosse, this is June to early August. These points are probably your points that you guys have put into eBird. You can find them next to gravel rooftops. And if you go on Google Earth, gravel rooftops have a distinct color. And I'll show you more here. So that light gray, I don't think is gravel. That dark gray may just be the rubberized substrate. So it's kind of tricky finding gravel rooftops. But if you look at that upper right roof, sort of beige and gray and a bunch of colors, that looks very much like gravel. So they may be nesting on that rooftop in the upper right. So these are all birds during the breeding season. That white surface for rooftops is the newer materials that people are converting their rooftops to. It's like a plastic kind of canvas, plastic coated canvas, and it may be more sustainable, and but nighthawks won't use it. The rest of the year, the nighthawks migrate to South America, but because nighthawks are aerial insectivores, they trawl the air like a baleen whale with their mouths open. And they can eat on the wing and migrate further than a lot of birds can in one day. They are the last to arrive at their breeding grounds late May to June, and the first to leave starting in early August. They fly to Argentina or Brazil by January, hang out in heavily logged forests because that's what they like. They like open forests for a month or two and then turn around and come back. And why do I talk about this mysterious bird? Well, it's kind of going away in a lot of places, and there's a lot to understand about it that we don't know. So this is a typical day for me searching for a gravel rooftop for a nighthawk nest in South Dakota. And you can see I flushed one bird. She's on the parapet, and then she jumped over the side. There was another one flying around the background. So a lot of the time people didn't know they had nighthawks on their roofs. They are so great at camouflage. They tend only to come out at sunset. So part of my work was explaining what a nighthawk was and why it was important to study. So why did I study common nighthawks? Well, here's some cool facts about nighthawks. Number one, they are built to fly and not much else. So birds stand on their tarsal metatarsus. It's the fusion of the tarsi and the metatarsus. On a shorebird like this that spends a lot of time on the ground, it's a long bone. Here's the equivalent in human bones. So here are the human tarsi and the metatarsus. We have a bunch of bones that make up a tarsus, the talus, and the navicular, cuneiforms, cuboid, and calcaneus bones. Nighthawks have really short metatarsi. This makes walking a challenge even on a level ground. So it's pretty clumsy on the gravel, but they make do. It also makes perching in a tree difficult, so they lie on the branch parallel to it. Darwin said natural selection is economical, so if something isn't useful, it's minimized. And he gives the example of a flightless bird on an island with no predators. So thus, nighthawks have short legs. They don't really need them. If your means of getting around doesn't involve walking, wading, paddling, or climbing, get rid of the mechanism. So those stiff wings that they have give sudden lift, but they don't bend around underbrush, and the feet are pretty economical. That's the life of a nighthawk. But that suits them fine. Their long pointed wings mean they could spend 7 to 8 months out of the year migrating and eating while they fly. But there is one drawback to these short legs. This is a 2-week-old chick. and on the right, and on the left is a picture of an adult nighthawk toe. They have one long middle claw called the pectinate claw. It has a comb. So on this chick on the right, you can see the toes. They don't really have one. They haven't developed it yet. But on the adults, there's this long comb. And it takes a while to develop. Until lately, common nighthawk experts, meaning one of my committee members, didn't believe that they had a use for these pectinate claws because their legs were so short. They thought there's no way those short legs can reach anywhere of any consequence. But then I took this picture using one of my game cameras at a nest. And in case you can't quite see what's going on, there she is. She's itching her head with her really short leg, like a dog. Okay, they have a really interesting social life. Sometimes males are present and sometimes they are not. So you've probably seen that boom call before. Males are important because they are incredibly territorial. This is a nighthawk doing a boom call in which they spread the feathers at the bottom of their dive, creating that whirring sound. They do this to ward off intruders like humans, predators, but mostly it's for other males. And occasionally a female will do this as well. There is some debate about how much females do this. Nighthawks have a lot of attitude and not much else. They have puny bills and claws. So even their chicks have to have attitude if they're discovered. But they can't really do any harm. Females can be aggressive. So this is a female at a nest and she's trying to scare me away, but she doesn't really have anything to back it up with. So they use this broken wing routine like killdeer, and I should say killdeer on these roof as well. So kind of interesting relationship. They're also really good at luring you away. So this is a female I flushed and she just wants me to follow her everywhere and away from her eggs. And it's pretty effective because if you're not paying attention to where she came from, you'll never find those eggs. Okay, more about their social life. So I have to tell you a story to demonstrate this. This male is a sentinel. This is the spot he sat in day after day, month after month during the breeding season for the 3 years I monitored this roof. Same bird every time. And I had to tiptoe past him every time. Sometimes he lifted off and called and I couldn't get close to the females before he alerted them. This is where he sat in that round circle there. This is Elk Point Elementary School in South Dakota. This is where his females laid eggs the first year. This is where they laid them the second year. This is where they laid them the third year. Pretty consistent, right? This one on the lower left, this one I called Lady Sisyphus. In 3 years and in some years with 2 nest attempts, she never successfully hatched an egg. I believe this is because she was on the outskirts and was not under the protection of the sentinel male. And was it the predators that made it difficult for her? No. It was a sneaker male. So occasionally when I visited, I would observe a second male on the roof and he mated with her while she was incubating her eggs and then she abandoned them. So it's kind of an interesting byproduct of social systems and animals. So sneaker males are known in classic ecological studies because of elephant seals. So you have one big guy in a harem. And then another male comes along to challenge him. And then while they're fighting, a sneaker male comes in and steals his lady. So only 1% of the time does this actually work out for the sneaker male. So when the sneaker or the challenger male is successful in developing a relationship with a female, she'll abandon their young, and sometimes the new male will engage in infanticide to hurry the process of ensuring his own DNA is passed down. So this happens with lions and primates that live in troops and harems. So I'm thinking this is what's happening with Lady Sisyphus and her unsuccessful attempts to hatch a chick, because she keeps abandoning these eggs when the sneaker male shows up, but she never successfully hatches the second one. This happened with other birds. So this female also abandoned her eggs. But males are actually pretty great to have around. So you have a male here on the right. They're being photobombed by this mourning dove. In the middle is a female, and then so yeah, here's the female and then here's the chick. So males can thermoregulate the female, who is thermoregulating the chick. Okay, so they also incubate eggs. So this is a male on the eggs. Sorry, this is a female on the eggs. And then here's a male coming in to relieve the female. He has the bigger throat patch. And this male, he looks a little darker too. Okay, and they even feed chicks. So in case you can't quite see it, that's him feeding the chick. Here's the female. Ultimately, males are good. Half the nest with males successfully fledge a chick. That's better than the overall success rate for my nest, which was 10% for fledging at least one chick. Other animals on the roofs that they interact with are tree sparrows, house sparrows, robins, grackles, kestrels, mourning doves, rock pigeons, turkey vultures, squirrels, and starlings. Killdeer like to nest on the gravel too. They might even serve as a sentinel, just like the male. If you ever stumble across a killdeer nest, you know how noisy they are. They are very observant. I spent a lot of days trying to tiptoe past killdeer nests on roofs so that I could get close to nighthawk nests and see where they flushed from. But like with the male nighthawks, half the nests with killdeer around successfully fledge a chick. That's better than the overall 10%. I suspect that killdeer and male nighthawks are deterrents for predators and competitors that harass incubating females. But this is the big problem. And crows are also the reason why they don't exist in the Northeast. Let me explain why. So gravel rooftops are being replaced by other materials. So you see on the bottom there, that's the gravel rooftop. The middle roof there, that's the rubberized substrate. Sometimes people, when they repair their roofs, they don't replace the gravel these days. They have different ways of holding down that rubberized substrate. That's what the gravel's supposed to do. And I also think it cools the roof. But now lately they are switching over to this white plastic kind of canvas material. And it has the potential to be more energy efficient, and we all like that, right? So what did the New Hampshire Audubon do? They sent out teams of volunteers to rooftops that had been converted from gravel long ago to put out small gravel patches. And most of the time, nighthawks didn't show up. They had already kind of moved on. They have so much fidelity to their nest site. They probably didn't know this gravel patch existed, but for the few that did, the gravel patch served as a big marquee over the nest site, advertising to crows that here lies a nighthawk nest. So fortunately, we don't have as many crows here in La Crosse as they do in the Northeast. Here in the driftless area, maybe Chicago, we have another problem, and that's gulls. So no one's tried the gravel patch trick on them yet, but I suspect they will get the same result. Crows and gulls are an example of our urban generalists that are attracted to our trash and having an impact on other animals. So remember this guy? So this is the Sentinel's roof. For 3 years, there was a pattern, females returning to the same spot, which led me to think they might be the same individuals. And this was an example of nest site fidelity, you know, the same female coming back to the same spot year after year. And this led me to think that just maybe the females are returning to the place where they might have hatched. I had a pretty low success rate for nesting, so I collected a lot of dead chicks and eggs and put them in the freezer. And I approached our genetics lab at University of South Dakota and asked if they were interested in doing a genetic study. And what they found is that my nest sites here in Yankton, Vermilion, and Elk Point and North Sources City were separated by row crop, which they won't use. It turns out the females are very closely related to one another within each of these towns, but not between the towns. So what that says to me is that each of these towns have sort of distinct genetic markers, and there may be some inbreeding within the towns, just within the female genetic material. Sadly, we only had money for a mitochondrial DNA study, which limits us to look at the relatedness between mothers of the chicks and eggs. Relatedness between fathers would have required DNA analysis from the cell's nucleus, and I suspect based upon the variation of whether males are present, that their nest site fidelity is pretty low. So often I think one male will cover multiple roofs. And in the case of the sentinel bird story, he had enough females that stayed on one roof. So it's not uncommon for males to have larger ranges than females in the animal world. But females aren't moving around, and each town is a unique subpopulation with not much genetic diversity or gene flow between the towns. And that can be a problem for conservation. Population bottlenecks lead to inbreeding and unfavorable traits persisting, and the inability to adapt because of the lack of diversity of traits to draw from. Okay, cool fact number 3. How are we doing on time? Okay, great. They are important. So nighthawks are part of a guild, and that's a group of animals that make their living in similar ways, called aerial insectivores. As I've mentioned, they fly in the air and feed while flying, the insects that others cannot, and they are part of the land and water continuum of ecosystems, so each feeds into each other. Each animal here is affected by what happens on land and water. Insectivores need both the land and the water, so do many organisms in this picture. For insects that hatch out of the water, that rely on a lot of materials, detritus in the river, every element of this picture is related to each other in some way or another. So aerial insectivores fit into the flow of nutrients in both aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems and the continuum between those two, but they also occupy another interacting ecosystem, and that's the air. So in fact, scientists are starting to map the 3-dimensional airspace as a habitat with separate niches. So this is a series of 3D Doppler images of birds erupting from a roost at sunrise in Jacksonville, Florida by the National Weather Service. And what you'll notice is as I advance through these slides, you'll see different sections of birds at different heights. So here we go. And they've actually figured out there's different species at different heights. So waterfowl tend to fly really high, and then raptors, and then songbirds. So within the aerial insectivore guild, they fly at different heights. So indicators of the national population status of all these occurring native bird species. This is Canada did a very good job of mapping all the guilds. And you can see the 2 lowest guilds, the ones that are racing to the bottom are grassland birds and aerial insectivores, and nighthawks are members of both of those guilds. They are the fastest dwindling birds in the world. Bats are another aerial insectivore, and they have a unique problem. So with the loss of 6 million bats in the last 15 years due to white nose syndrome, a fungus from Europe introduced to North America, it will take a while for those bats to develop immunity. So the point at which the future starts, so here we are in 2021, and those numbers may never rebound to what they once were. So you can see the dip and then sort of like the projection. And of course, COVID-19 isn't making bats any more popular, with the supposition that possibly that's where the virus originated. Mostly we think the aerial insectivore decline is linked to climate change. So with varying degrees of pressure on insects, which is what they eat, that may be the problem. And pesticide use is another issue as well. So lots of information here, but I got more. When we compare the aerial insectivores, they are active at different times of the day. So nighthawks are active around sunset and sunrise, but they can be active at any time of the day if the other members of the guild are absent. Bats, of course, are nocturnal. Swallows and swifts are active during the middle of the day. And swifts tend to fly at a higher rate than swallows, so that's how they divide up the day. And they forage at different heights, as I mentioned. And they also differ by prey size. So here are the 4 members of the aerial insectivores, but I'm going to change their size based upon their mouth size. So you can see bats are at least the bats around here are the smallest, eat the smallest of insects, and then we got swifts, and then swallows, and then the nighthawks have the biggest mouth. So having a diversity of animals in this group by time of day, position, and air column, and mouth size can give you a tremendous amount of diversity and insect control. So we should save them all, right? In the late 19th century, the precursors to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Office of Economic Ornithology, and later on the Division of Biological Survey, examined the stomachs of 23,000 birds from 100 species to get at this question. Are their food habits beneficial to us? And yes, they found that birds were consumers of agricultural pests. I found no studies on nighthawks, but this is a bird capable of consuming so much food because it is an aerial insectivore and the largest of them. And because it's energetically expensive for an animal to fly all day or all night, it makes them vulnerable. So they can eat a lot, but it also makes them vulnerable. They need to eat a lot in order to maintain their lifestyle. So each species is important because each individual consumes its weight in insect each day. And it's the paradox of insects, of aerial insectivores. So this is just one species in this graph here. This is the purple martin, and that bird can consume between 500 and 2,200 insects a day, mostly during the breeding season. So, deep breath. Aerial insectivores are financially important. For pest control in agricultural and in residential areas, they cost nothing and they don't gum up our waterways with pesticides. So this is a study that showed what economically we lose by losing bats due to white nose syndrome. Okay, so why are common nighthawks important? They are the least studied of the guild, but it has the ability to be active throughout the day while others take a break. The first time I ever saw a nighthawk was at Malheur National Wildlife Refuge in Oregon, and it was a huge flock of them flying during the day. So there weren't any bats to compete with them, but there were swallows around. And while it forages at some of the highest points in the air column or the lowest, it has the potential to forage lower when not competing with swallows or bats that are faster. So this is a friend of mine, Gabriel Foley, who noticed that nighthawks will change their height based upon whether bats are present. And it has the widest range of insects it can eat because it is bigger. Okay, if you don't like nighthawks yet, I have another secret about nighthawks. They have a cecum. This is an extra offshoot off the intestine that allows them to digest chitin, and that's the hard shell of some insects. And so more insects are available to them. None of the other members of this guild can eat chitin because they don't have a cecum. So in places like forests, they are able to go after beetles, which can be a nuisance species. And up in northern boreal forests in Canada, I have researcher friends who watch nighthawks eat beetles all evening long. So nighthawks can fill in for other aerial insectivores if their numbers dwindle. And while it can live in many habitats, I mentioned these habitats are dwindling. So for example, we lost 70% of our grassland in North America during the biofuel boom. That's the equivalent of the size of Kansas in the last 15 years. And then I found them, that they are still willing to eat over grazing areas, pastures, and they can coexist with row crops if there's enough grazing area for them to breed in. So, and this is backed by other researchers who found that some grassland birds coexist with grazing animals. And that's great news for a bird that can consume large prey, because there is a large prey that is a pest in agriculture, and that's the cutworm moth, which is too big for anything to eat except for a nighthawk. All right, number 4, they are better suited to climate change than most birds to a point. They're champions at temperature regulation, but I think I found their limit on a rooftop. So nighthawks and other members of its family, so these are the goatsuckers, they have the ability to flutter their gular region when it gets too hot. So you can see this chick move into the shade and then start vibrating its throat. And that's the chick trying to stay cool. Here's a close-up of that. So the gular flutter action is the vibration of the floor of the mouth and upper throat in birds. Heat energy changes liquid water to vapor, and this heat is supplied by the body. So the process cools the body by returning cooled blood from the mouth back to the body. So this circulation of hot and cold is really efficient. Nighthawks are especially effective at this because they have wide vascular mouths. You can see on the picture on the right for a chick. That's something that all members of their order, the nightjars, have. And you can see this behavior a lot in pelicans and cormorants, among other birds. So I have a picture of a cormorant here that kind of demonstrates that from a textbook. They also have the ability to walk and find shade within a couple days of hatching. They are semi-precocial, meaning they are hatched at a greater amount of development than a songbird, but that means they might find shade next to your camera that is supposed to be taking pictures of them at their nest. And since they are insectivores, their food is ephemeral, so it comes and goes with weather. And so, in fact, I found some research on the recent mysterious bird deaths in New Mexico. It turns out the birds were, a lot of them were aerial insectivores, and they encountered a cold snap. So perhaps that was more than they can handle in terms of finding food during a stressful period. So that's why it's important for them to have mechanisms in place to survive temperature extremes. And in extreme temperatures, a lot of insectivores hunker down and slow their metabolism for the day. This is a process called torpor. So it can be like 90 degrees down here on the ground, but it could be 105, 110, 120 degrees on a rooftop. And they chose that, and they seem to do okay, but it's starting to get too hot for them. I mentioned cold too, so this is another member of the goatsuckers that has the ability to hibernate. So the common poorwill was first described by Lewis and Clark in their journals when the Native Americans along the Missouri River pointed out that this bird was in a snowbank. So that's the first observation of torpor or hibernation in a bird in the literature. Lewis and Clark did that. So incidentally, common poorwills don't migrate very far. They don't need to. They can hibernate when there is no food, so they only have to migrate as far as northern Mexico. And temperature regulation is important if nighthawks are going to use urban rooftops, which are hotter than other habitats. And sometimes they have nowhere else to go because they've lost their grasslands or forests or sandbars. So when I compared temperatures between nearby grasslands and flat gravel rooftops, I found the maximum rooftop temperature typically hotter. It can be 90 degrees in town and 120 degrees on a rooftop. So they may be forced to go into urban areas on rooftops where it may be too hot for them, and it's starting to get a lot hotter, of course. So in my study area, not only was it getting hotter, but the humidity was going up and the cloud cover was going down in my study area since the 1950s. So overall, it's just getting kind of more and more unbearable. And yet the nighthawks keep coming back to urban areas. But there is a limit to what they can take in these urban areas. I found that the success rate for them was 10%, and that's equivalent to a nighthawk population in Florida, which is in steep decline. And this is because unsuccessfully hatched eggs tend to be those that experience extreme temperatures. So really like the pinch point for them is whether they can hatch an egg. Once they can hatch and move around, they're pretty good at staying cool. But they do have elevated stress hormone levels due to sudden higher temperatures. So a high baseline stress hormone means that this is your normal operating system is at its limit. And if that's compromised, then you can't effectively flee a predator, fight disease, fast during food shortages, or grow big and strong so you can take off and fly to Argentina in a month. Those stress hormones can be kind of a lot to take. And even if you are particularly heat tolerant, it is costly. So they get their water from their food and they tend to feed at sunrise and sunset So there's no water available to replace the evaporative water loss they experience during the day due to, gular fluttering. Actually, you lose quite a bit of water. And if you do this for a few hours, then you can lose 9% of your body mass in a few hours. And so temperatures that induce this gular flutter behavior tends to account for about 37% of the breeding season. So that's a lot of time losing water. So I should mention that nightjars are second only to doves and pigeons within the bird class in terms of heat tolerance. Pigeons and doves have the additional ability to cutaneously evaporate heat. They don't have sweat glands, but you get the idea. They have some sort of liquid mechanism to dissipate heat. They are very heat tolerant, and nightjars and even their chicks are pretty heat tolerant, even without this mechanism. So it was pretty surprising to see how well the chicks could tolerate the heat. So if they have to deal with predators like crows, whose effects on nighthawk nests have been well documented in the Northeast, and in my study area, I noticed grackles and mourning doves have caused mother nighthawks to leave their nest for extensive periods of time and then cause nest failure. If they have to deal with predators, then in the heat, it's usually too much for them. Or if their parents have to deal with maintenance on these roofs. So this bird abandoned her nest after days of window washing. And these are not delicate birds. So this female successfully fledged chicks next to a hospital helicopter pad for 3 years. And then the last year there was construction within feet of her eggs, and she still managed to hatch those chicks. So they go through a lot, but even that, it's becoming too much for them. So this bird lost her rooftop site in New Hampshire, so she moved to a gravel parking lot, and people put cones around her nest. This happened also in Ohio at a church parking lot. And this happened in my study area. This is Yankton Mall in South Dakota. They resurfaced their roof, and then the nighthawks moved to the parking lot, and some people who work in a warehouse put some cones around that nest. I'm not sure if they made it, but nighthawks keep trying. So another friend of mine runs the Fellow Mortals Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in Lake Geneva, and she raises a lot of chicks that are found on the ground. And too much disturbance means they have to lure that potential predator away, and that's time they lose helping their chicks stay cool. So there's a chick using its mother to stay cool. Okay, so nighthawks are champions of thermoregulation. And if they're struggling, what does that say about less tolerant organisms in hotter environments where they have no other choice in habitat? So on the upper left, that's North America. On the lower left, that's Europe, and the lower right is Asia, and then the upper right is Africa. And so these are extreme weather heat events over the years. And you can see North America isn't doing quite as bad as Europe and Asia or Africa. So they are like the canary in the coal mine. It's a bird that can be virtually anywhere, anytime, and eat almost anything. That's an insect, but that's what a generalist still is. And if it fills in for other animals that are dwindling, and then if it struggles, then that's a lot to take in, right? All right, back to the good news. So we've talked about some mysteries of this bird and the beginnings of understanding it. How do we keep it around long enough to explore its biology further? First of all, I should say that urban cats are one of the greatest threats to any bird. And this urban nighthawk chick, when it fledges to the ground, has not adapted its camouflage to green grass. So moving to urban areas is a relatively new thing to this bird that has been around since the last ice age. And so it doesn't have many opportunities for camouflage once it fledges. So it's pretty vulnerable to cats. So what can we do? We can leash our cats. These are my cats. I take them outside on a leash. Yes, I'm one of those crazy people, but it works. And think about what we can do about feral cats. Eco roofs. So there's now a movement for people to convert their roofs not to the white plastic canvas material, but instead to an eco roof that is energy efficient, and you can mix in some gravel for wildlife. Not only nighthawks, but killdeer and other animals as well use these gravel rooftops. We should conserve our grassland and open forest and sandbars wherever they still exist. So this is a picture, the top one is the 1800s Missouri River outside of Vermilion, South Dakota. Yellow is grassland, the green are forest, the beige is sandbars, and then they built dams in the 1950s, and they converted a lot of the forest and grassland to agricultural areas in brown. So that tells you what's happened between the 1800s and 1950s, and you can just imagine where it's been since then. We can mix pastures in with row crops. So it's great in Wisconsin. We have a lot of pastures, a lot of dairy farms, and those pastures may prove to be kind of an important area for them. And if there isn't enough reason to reduce plastics in our life, now there's this. So it's not just the plastic beads in our soap, it's the plastics in our fleece clothing. A grad student at UW La Crosse is finding that it is the primary source of microplastics in the stomachs of fish. They move through the food web and then they end up in aerial insectivores' diet. What else can we do? We can retain downed wood and snags for flycatchers. So some people consider them also aerial insectivores. They don't have as highly energetic lifestyle, being kind of sit and wait predators, but they are also in trouble here in Wisconsin. They do like downed wood and snags, so a little pitch for the flycatchers. There are people who are building artificial structures for barn swallows who are in a lot of trouble in the state. So instead of destroying a nest that might be inconveniently hanging over a doorway, which might be too late for the bird to re-nest, instead, I've talked to people who hang a dryer sheet. So if you ever have a barn swallow that's sort of trying to build a nest in an annoying place, you could instead hang a dryer sheet so they don't like the smell of that where they're building a nest, and try to do it early enough so they can build a nest somewhere else. Spreading out bat colonies into nest boxes might help prevent white nose syndrome spread. If bats nest in a home, then homeowners can use a PVC pipe pointed downward at the entry point to prevent re-entry after they're done with hibernation. So if you've ever had bats in your walls, that's one option for you. Report your birds on eBird. It might be the key to helping save the vulnerable species with little information like a bank swallow. And when it comes time helping with the breeding bird atlas and the breeding bird survey and all the other counts that you guys do are so valuable. I can't tell you how much I relied on eBird for my initial data to set up my study. So a lot of scientists use it. It's hard to gather data on crepuscular birds, so birds that are active around sunset and sunrise, and nocturnal birds. But these atlases sometimes have special surveys for those times of day in Texas. So I know that Wisconsin DNR runs a nocturnal and a night survey as well. So if you feel like participating in those, I highly encourage it. There's of course Swift watches. There's a working group, Western Great Lakes Bird and Bat Observatory. We can report your Swift watches. I've put Bill Mueller, but I believe he is retired. So there's got to be a different way to contact them now. Chimneyswifts.org has info on Swift Nights Out and what you can do to have swifts in your chimney, and other helpful info. Expert birders provide great data, so anytime you want to contribute to any of these studies, that's great. Purple martins seem to do well around the Great Lakes, and so they have a conservation association that has information on attracting purple martin colonies to your yard and reporting nest data. So I want to thank you all for having me, and if there is time for questions, I am happy to answer them.
Thank you, Gretchen. That was a wonderful program. Very interesting. I was wondering about whippoorwills. I mean, it's probably mostly anecdotal information, but it appears, that their population in Wisconsin has been declining for several years. And so am I right that they pretty much need a woodland, undisturbed woodland habitat? And are there any efforts to bring up their population that you know of in the state?
I used to be on your rare birds. There was a rare bird sighting email list, and somebody like maybe a year or two ago emailed and said he was starting a whippoorwill study in this area, and then I never heard again about it. I had contacted him and said, do you want some help? Because I have nightjar experience, and then nothing came of it. So there's somebody out there who's studying it. I know that occasionally somebody will contact me and say, hey, did you know there's a nighthawk in this area? And then I'll go out to their property and find that it's a whippoorwill. So I know that they're around. I mean, you've probably all heard them at night in the bluffs. So I don't know what their exact status is in the area, unfortunately.
Yeah, they're amazing bird also.
Yeah, absolutely. I do want to say that I'm excited that you're having Laura Erickson speak. So she at one time rehabbed nighthawks. I read her blog and really fascinating stuff. So I may come back and see her talk.
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, she should be great. Yep, that's on May 19th.
Excellent.
Yeah. So again, nighthawks are with the size of their mouth. You said that their diameter of insect, if you will, and types of insects can be really varied. And I would imagine that in certain agricultural areas, with organic farming, especially being really increasing in this area, mostly in Vernon County for sure, that there might be a lot of interest in controlling insects naturally, and I don't know how that all would play out as far as providing habitat for for nightjars, but it's just an interesting thought that I had. Yeah,
there are people who. So I talked to someone once who was studying organic farming and attracting bats to farms, and they had some success with setting up boxes for bats. Particularly, so these were farms in Pennsylvania. They were really interested in supplementing habitat for bats that were being decimated by white nose syndrome. And we do have some of it here, not as bad as it is in Pennsylvania, but that's something to think about, is like bat boxes if people are interested in natural ways of pest control on their property. I think bats, it's hard to attract nighthawks. Like if they're not scoping out your yard, they're probably not going to come back. They have a lot of nest fidelity, so they keep coming back to the same spot year after year.
Right. Yep.
I have a question for
you. Yeah.
Of course. Yeah. I went to a few kind of Zoom meetings recently about well, there's just so much interest in native plantings, like this Doug Talmy book of like we should have so many native plants in our yards, and then primarily because they attract insects, and then insects are food for birds. But that I'm kind of wondering in terms of the nighthawks, like, is there any research are the total number of insects like way down, or is that not a limiting factor for them? Or do they have enough food once they hatch? And
they can eat a lot of things. So I haven't run across a study about biomass of insects and whether that has an effect on nighthawk populations. There have been studies on birds in general and insect biomass decline. So there have been some studies in Europe about neonicotinoid pesticide use and what that's done to the sheer biomass of insects. But I think more interestingly is that it cuts down on the biodiversity of insects. So when you kill everything, you kill the beneficial insects, the ones that are predators that feed on the ones you don't want. But it's a complex issue about like insect control. How do you control for the ones you don't want and the ones you do? And generally, like biodiversity is good news for everyone, right?
Oh,
So to answer your question about native planting, I
mean,
don't think you can go wrong with that as a strategy.
yeah, I suppose if we put native shrubs in our yards, it won't necessarily help the nighthawk, but I do think it would help the birds in general, though. I mean,
Yeah, it'll help a lot of things for sure.
more natives. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, great question.
Well, I had a question. Really great presentation, by the way. Yeah, I was just wondering, the nighthawk's prey, is it more aquatic invertebrates, or is it kind of a mix of aquatic invertebrates and terrestrial, or do they focus on one or the other? I'm just curious about that.
So they're prey, because they can eat so many things, it varies widely by what's available. They'll just eat anything. If they're feeding over aquatic areas, then chances are they're eating a lot of aquatic insects. If they're flying over downtown, then they're probably eating a lot of mosquitoes or whatever's available downtown. They can eat moths, they can eat so many things. So it just varies by where they are. The researchers I know who study them in boreal forests in Canada, they eat a lot of beetles. We don't really have a lot of beetles flying around here, so I doubt they eat them. Does that help answer your question? So it's just
Yep.
kind of, yeah.
Yeah, so they're kind of generalists. I gotcha. Cool.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question. I had to step out for a minute and I missed why you were studying them in South Dakota.
Oh, okay. So I don't think I ever explained that, so it's a good question. So I studied them in South Dakota because I was interested in studying a bird that was in decline. I was interested in studying a grassland bird that was in decline in an area where grasslands were in decline. So I was curious as to see how they would adapt once they lost their grassland habitat. I wanted to sort of study that sort of transition from grassland to gravel rooftops. And I wanted to study an aerial insectivore that had some physiology question that I can answer. So the person I studied under, David Swanson, is an ornithologist in South Dakota, and he is specialized in how birds adapt to either extreme heat or cold. Most of his students study cold tolerance in birds. I was his first student who studied heat tolerance. So nighthawks answered a lot of questions. They are extremely heat tolerant, but they're still struggling because they moved onto these rooftops that are just getting way too hot even for them. So I was able to study a lot of things about them, and they were really fascinating.
One more question. How do they actually feed their young?
How do they feed their young?
Regurgitate or catch?
Sorry, say that again.
Do they feed them whole insects or do they regurgitate?
That's a good question. I don't know. I've never been able. So I did a feeding survey on swallows in Oregon, where we caught swallows the second they got into the nest box and then pulled out the bolus of food before they could feed their chicks. And for swallows, it was like live squirming insects. They didn't do anything to masticate the insects. They were just disgorging whole insects into their chicks' mouth. I don't know if nighthawks do that. Like swallows will fly for 15 minutes and come back with a big ball of insects. I don't know. I haven't studied that question in nighthawks. I don't know whether they munch it down, but they've got quite a bit of room in their mouth to keep live insects around. So I'm guessing that they're giving them whole live insects.
Thank you. Your talk was very good.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah, it's just a guess. There's so many guesses to be made. I'm so sorry that I don't have the exact answer.
Hey, I'll jump in. This is Maggie Jones. Thanks for letting me be here today, and I'm enjoying this so much. I'm curious about the eco roofs, and will they nest among vegetation? Do they get shade? It looked like there was shrubbery on that eco roof. Would you talk about that more?
Yeah, I don't think, so there was a grad student at University of Oregon in Eugene who came up with this eco roof solution. So she was actually a planning student. So nighthawks and killdeer are species of concern in the Willamette Valley of Oregon. It's an agricultural area. And so she wanted to study how to design a building that would appeal to these two rooftop species while still being eco-friendly. So providing some benefit to the building in terms of sustainability, in terms of cooling the roof. And so she came up with the solution of keeping a fair amount of gravel and then mixing in vegetation to keep the roof cool. And I don't know if there was a second part to her study where maybe an ecologist actually studied whether the birds would take to this. But it was a very interesting idea. And I have to believe it actually might actually work because I showed you some rooftops and it was like a great expanse of gravel, but a lot of rooftops were really small and it had a lot going on, like transom windows and chimneys and like soccer balls and garbage and a lot of other animals. So they do pretty well with a lot of, frankly, crap on these roofs. So I can just imagine that they might be okay with the vegetation because they might actually use it as a place to find shade. So a lot of these chicks within a day will go find shade on their own. So again, another good question that I can only give like the best of guesses to. And it's another unanswered question. Yeah. Thank you though. That's great.
Thank you.
Anybody else have a question for Gretchen? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Gretchen, for the presentation. It was very interesting.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you for
We
being
enjoyed it.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Thanks everybody for watching and listening. And like I said, don't forget our next meeting coming up in March 17th, Wednesday at 7 p.m. And that will be Carla Bohm with the International Owl Center, Houston, Minnesota, talking about owls. So that should be interesting. All right.
Doing this worked out good, I think.
So I'm gonna sign off.
Good morning, everybody.
Bye, everybody. Stay warm.